Okay, welcome everyone to the Closing the Gender Wealth Gap Forum. You are here at the Understanding White Supremacy, How to Challenge and Dismantle session. My name is Kelly Sheard. I'm the director of the Gender Wealth Institute with Women's Way, and we're excited to have so many of you join us today. My role and my time with you, I'll be going over who we are as Women's Way and provide a little bit of the framework for why we do the work we do and why we're talking about white supremacy. I'll introduce our amazing panelist and our moderator, and then we'll lead you to the next part of your journey. So today's forum is a part of a series whose purpose is to educate different stakeholders about the drivers of the gender wealth gap and provide actionable steps each of us can take to close the gender wealth gap. Since 2020, we have conducted sessions in this series focused on a variety of topics, ranging from early childhood education, strengthening that sector, to increasing access to affordable housing, to equity and grant making. Today's session focuses on white supremacy and how to challenge and dismantle it. You'll hear from 4 amazing speakers who will model authentic probing from an internal and organizational lens. You'll also have the opportunity to ask questions to the speakers via the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to address as many of your questions as possible. The chat will also be open, and we ask that people abide by the community guidelines, which will pop into the chat shortly. So your questions will go in the Q&A box, and that will trigger the facilitator and moderator to be able to see them and address them. And your comments or your yes and your affirmations will go into the chat. We would like to thank Permit Capital Advisors whose support helps us make these sessions possible. And I also want to let you know that this event will be recorded. So I'm going to start off by providing an overview of the economic state of women and why Women's Way is investing its resources into addressing the gender wealth gap. So who we are, Women's Way is the region's leading nonprofit organization dedicated to the advancement of women and girls and gender equity. And we're the first umbrella funding federation in the United States specifically dedicated to women's issues. So a little bit about the economic state of women pre-COVID. So pre-COVID, we knew that nationally, women and children were 73% of the poor. And more regionally, Philadelphia had the highest poverty rate at just above 25% amongst the 10 largest cities. The region's largest demographic group of those living in poverty were women aged 25 to 35. And just over 37% of children were living in poverty pre-COVID. And as we continue to grapple with the effects and the impact of COVID, we know that since the onset, nationally, 2.5 million women have lost their jobs or dropped out of the workforce due to COVID. Some of the driving factors, women account for 74% of employment in high contact occupations. Women occupy low paying jobs that do not have benefits or paid family and medical leave. And in our country, we are contending with a lack of a childcare infrastructure and family-forward workplace policies that keep people safe. This is just a quote that talks a little bit about the exacerbation of gender inequality in the labor force due to COVID. And it reads, if conditions for families do not improve, and if levels of maternal labor force participation and work hours experienced during the pandemic persist long-term, lost wages would amount to $64.5 billion per year. So here at Women's Way, we are very much focused on the gender wealth gap. And when we look at that, at median, single white women own 32 cents on the dollar compared to single white men. Black and Latinx women own less than a penny, and this has not improved over the past 50 years. And what this looks like and how this shows up, some of the causes for women earn less money than men, and this is likely a statistic that many of you are familiar with. But there are other ways that this comes up. Women are more vulnerable to predatory lending. Women hold more debt, including 2/3 of all student debt. Women provide the majority of unpaid caregiving, and the stats go on and on. So the way that the gender wealth gap shows up is not just in the wage gap, which is the difference in how much women earn, but in all the other ways that wealth shows up. So why build wealth? And again, just to make a distinction between talking about wages and wealth. So wages are sort of like saying, you know, I am able to have a really great day when the sun is shining. And wealth is the distinction between saying, when it rains, I have my rain boots and my rain slicker and my umbrella, and in some cases, the life raft that I need to be able to navigate. So it's all the supportive structure that you need to be able to navigate. So wealth and assets related to wealth enable women to remain stable through financial emergencies, to take risks that result in better jobs or business startups, to retire securely. Wealth allows women to pass on security to the next generation. And rightly or wrongly, wealth allows women to participate in and shape political and social agendas. So wealth is critically important for women and for all of us. So with Women's Way, the way that we initially came to the conversation around closing the gender wealth gap was through our work through the Women's Economic Security Initiative, or WESI. So the goal of WESI was to build a long-term systems-level collaborative initiative centered around the shared vision that all women in the Philadelphia region attain financial well-being for themselves and for their families. So WESI was all about fostering systems-level learning and change and breaking down silos, again, across organizations and sectors. Where we are today, WESI evolved into the Gender Wealth Institute, which launched in September of 2021. So the mission of the Gender Wealth Institute is to close the gender wealth gap in the Philadelphia region by advancing research and practical solutions that build wealth for women who are economically insecure. So GWI works in 3 domains: learning, scaling, and influencing. GWI is the latest iteration of our work with the closing the gender wealth gap, and we are excited to continue the work of WESI. So that brings us to our conversation today, which is white supremacy, how to challenge and dismantle it. So we want to sort of acknowledge what might be a little bit of an elephant in the room, which is tackling this question of, why is a gender justice organization talking about white supremacy? So we know that white supremacy twists and distorts identity politics and the potential and possibility of identity politics for all women. The history of who we are and what we're currently experiencing shapes our engagement with public policy, with civic life, with social systems, and with democracy. If we take seriously the obligation to address and redress the inequalities and gross miscarriage of justice experienced actively and acutely by women from marginalized identities, we have to name and claim the ideology that creates, maintains, and perpetuates gender injustice, racial injustice, economic injustice, and all the iterations and intersections of injustice that we're currently contending with. That ideology is white supremacy. So what do you mean by white supremacy? This is a term that is super loaded and has lots of connotations, and often people think of, you know, Proud Boys or the KKK or folks in white hoods, or think of really extreme examples of white supremacy, but this is the definition that we're working off of. So white supremacy is a pseudo-scientific concept of race to create whiteness and a hierarchy of racialized value in order to disconnect and divide white people from Black, Indigenous, and people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color from each other, white people from other white people, each and all of us from the earth, the sun, the wind, the water, the stars, and the animals that roam the earth, and each of us from ourselves. White supremacy culture is the widespread ideology baked into the beliefs and values and norms and standards of our groups and our communities and our towns and states and our ways of being with each other that teach us both overtly and covertly that whiteness holds value and whiteness is value. So you'll see some other bullets here that are other sorts of examples or iterations of white supremacy culture. They're likely things that you've heard, things that you experience, things that you contend with, but these are some of the myths of white supremacy culture that are baked into how we experience each other and how we're experiencing the world. So white supremacy is not an extreme thought process of fringe groups. White supremacy is a project of psychic conditioning and toxic belonging. It's in the air we breathe. And so I'll just leave a moment for folks to read this quote here. I have found my own participation in this ideology both enraging and heartbreaking. What I know is that the invitation to join is toxic to all who say yes. When I say yes, when we say yes, we visit this toxicity on others and everybody suffers, including us. And when I say no, when we say no, for we have among us those who have said no from the very beginning, when we say no, we discover the secret of joy. So the next thing you might be wondering is, what does white supremacy have to do with wealth inequality? So here's some statistics about wealth distribution showing that access to and the experience of wealth in the US is not evenly distributed in any sense of the word. So you can see that 1% of the population holds 47% of the nation's wealth, which is gross and extreme. But further, to expand upon that, in the US, the system of capitalism that the economy is based on was founded on the basis of white supremacy. So the sharpest and clearest example of this is the exploitation of Africans as enslaved laborers and the ugly system of slavery upon which this nation was founded. America's first big business was slavery, and slavery was a significant wealth generator for this country. Slavery allowed the US to become a global industrial power. Enslaved bodies were the greatest financial asset of this nation, and that foundation is what allows continued global economic dominance. The racist justification of slavery depended upon the devaluation and dehumanization of Africans. Devaluation and dehumanization of anyone other than white is the organizing framework of white supremacy. So another thing that we want to talk about is what we're doing here today. So what this conversation can be and will be, and what it is not. So white supremacy is a huge topic. And as I mentioned before, it's inescapable, it's in the air we breathe, and that means all of us. So we're having a very particular conversation here today about challenging the mental models of white supremacy in individuals and how white folks, and particularly white women, have endeavored to journey into anti-racism in their own personal and professional lives. So what we aim to do with this conversation today is shift the conditions that are holding the problem in place by addressing mental models. So this is the framework that we operate from as we think about system change. And this type of conversation addresses the bottom part, the transformative change, the implicit bias that comes through in your mental models. So this is, whoop, went a little too fast, sorry. This is not the total conversation about white supremacy, and depending on where you sit, this might not feel like this is even the most urgent way to start the conversation. We welcome that criticism and we sit with that tension. We want to offer that this is just one way that we've chosen to begin our exploration of white supremacy. We are committed as an organization, and our partners as well, to unpacking white supremacy, and we invite you to join us as we examine this concept from a myriad of angles. So all three people on the panel identify as white women. Our moderator is a person of color. Our intention was to model the process of self-reflection, interrogation, and mutual accountability we believe are necessary in order to shift internal mental models in the journey to effect change. The burden is not evenly distributed, and you'll see that reflected in the makeup of our panel today, but the burden is collective. So we just ask that you join us as we take our first imperfect steps into this conversation. So with that, I'm going to move into introducing our panelists, and bear with me as I pull up the bios. Give me just a second. Sorry. All right. Great. So first, we're going to start with Diane Cornman-Levy. Diane Cornman-Levy brings more than 30 years of nonprofit leadership, coalition building, community organizing, and fundraising experience to Women's Way. A tireless advocate for gender and racial equity, Diane joined Women's Way in January 2017 after running for state representative of the 168th district. Diane was also co-founder and executive director of 2 nonprofits, both of which work to improve education and economic equity for families. In each of these positions, Diane challenged the status quo through forging cross-sector partnerships and designing new programs that increased economic and education opportunities for families, teens, and self-taught artists with mental health challenges and returning citizens. During her tenure at Women's Way, she's led the transformation of the organization, including designing a new brand, creating new grant-making programs, building a citywide collaborative initiative to advance the economic security of women, and leading a year-long intervention to embed anti-racism in every aspect of Women's Way. Welcome, Diane. Next, we have Richman. Richman is an experienced social service researcher and nonprofit administrator who believes that organizations have an ethical imperative to use data to guide social justice work. Since moving to Philadelphia in 2005, she's traveled between academic and community spaces, working to connect theory with practice in nonprofit leadership, program development, and data-driven decision-making. Always working at the intersection of gender, sexuality, and structural inequality, earned her PhD in sociology at Temple University in 2013 and joined the William Way LGBT Community Center in 2019 as their Chief Operating Officer. She brings over 15 years of experience merging critical analysis with hands-on work rooted within communities. Welcome, Allie. Next, we have Kelly Croce Sorg. White, wealthy, and willfully ignorant, Kelly grew up uber privileged, the daughter of an MBA team owner. Always seeking self-improvement, Kelly thought she was woke until friend Aurora gifted her White Fragility by Dr. Robin DiAngelo, radically shifting her worldview and inspiring her to address her internalized racism to become a real friend to Aurora. In all their work together through the opt-in, Kelly dives deep into the uncomfortable but necessary conversations with her bestie in what she calls a love letter to her white friends and family, advocating for them to all do better, herself included. Welcome, Kelly. Finally, we have Deidre Ashton. Deidre is a psychotherapist and consultant who works with not-for-profit organizations, including their boards and educational institutions, in their ongoing journeys towards becoming liberatory institutions that deliver services and cultivate work environments rooted in racial justice. They provide tailored workshops and learning experiences, provide clinical experience and executive coaching in pursuit of these aims. During their career, Deidre has held clinical and executive directorship positions for organizations providing mental health care to communities that are marginalized based on race, gender identity, sexuality, and economic status. Deidre has trained therapists, counselors, and other human service professionals at graduate and postgraduate institutions in the areas of developing and implementing socially just and culturally sensitive counseling and healing practices. As a parent volunteer at their child's school, they founded and co-led the Parent and Caregivers Association Committee for Advancing Racial Equity in Our School, PCA Cares. Welcome, Deidre. And now I'll pass it along to our moderator and our panelists. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kelly, for orienting us and introducing us. So I'm just going to continue with the introductions a little bit and ask our panelists to share with us what their organizations do and why you chose to be on the panel. And I'm just going to kick it off with Allie.
Thanks, Deidre. Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here today. As Kelly said, I am the Chief Operating Officer over at William Way LGBT Community Center, which is a community space focusing on cultural, social, and empowerment programs that are for and by LGBTQIA people. I agreed to come here today in an effort to share what we at William Way, which is a historically white nonprofit here in Philadelphia, have learned, mistakes that we've made, and things that we're doing today, and to be in community with others who have been thinking deeply about this kind of work. So thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Sally. How about you, Diane?
Hi, great. It's such a great honor to be with all of you. I'm Diane Cornman-Levy, the Chief Disruptor at Women's Way. And you've heard something about Women's Way, but our focus is really about advancing the status of women and girls with the ultimate goal of achieving gender equity. And I'm here because as a white woman, a white female citizens, a white woman leader of an organization committed to advancing gender and racial equity, I think it's really important for me to talk about how white supremacy has impacted my thinking, my actions and behaviors on a personal, professional level, how I have unconsciously upheld white supremacy and done harm to people of color when I thought I was actually fighting racism, and what I am doing to challenge and dismantle my own internalized white supremacy on a personal, professional level. I also think it's really important for white folks to speak up about white supremacy because we don't talk about race enough because we're in positions of power and privilege. And for far too long, we have put the onus on talking about race and racism of Black and brown individuals, while white folks, like I have done, choose personal safety and comfort over addressing racism and our whiteness and associated unearned privileges and harm to people of color. So I'm delighted to be part of this conversation and to have a really open and honest conversation about this important topic. So thank you, Deidre.
Thanks, Diane. And last but not least, Kelly, if you want to share about your organization and what brings you here.
Thanks, Deirdre. And thank you for having me today. My name is Kelly Croce Sorg. I go by she and her. And I am co-founder of The Opt-in, which began as a podcast and has evolved into a learning community and a transformational change organization. And we have a theory of change that really says that in order to be more culturally competent, more culturally humble, however you want to talk about it, that really we need to develop our self-awareness, our racial literacy, our connection, and our stamina to stay in it. And so I bring that up only because we definitely focus on having the conversation around the most influential social identity, and that being race, and the most influential race being whiteness. And people who often hold that race, most including myself, know the least about it. And so when I say racial literacy, I'm talking about really understanding whiteness without shame and with accountability, because we get really stuck around talking about it. So any opportunity to talk about white supremacy, not the elephant in the room, but the room itself, I am happy to show up in any way I can to be of service.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
So Kelly provided us earlier with a definition of white supremacy that really resonated for me. I'm wondering if you all can talk about like how you come to how you understand white supremacy. How would you define it? What is it? And if you can speak from like your very personal understanding of it. And anyone can jump in first.
Well, I'll just piggyback on what Kelly said. I think for me, it is this concept of race to create whiteness and this hierarchy of human value that justifies the exploitation and oppression of people of color, so that white people, and historically, particularly white heterosexual Christian male, could be at a huge advantage economically, politically, culturally. So to me, the basis of this is hierarchy of human value, where, you know, white men are above white women are above women of color, and then you could add sexuality and sexual orientation and ability, and it's like this, and with that hierarchy of value, there's this hierarchy of who's deserving of what, right? And then I think on top of that, for me, it's this, which Kelly mentioned, this psychological conditioning, that we are conditioned to think that this current racial advantages and disadvantages is normal. I mean, I grew up, you know, predominantly seeing white people on TV and thinking that white is the norm, white is beautiful. And just give an example, I remember someone saying to me, oh, she's a beautiful Black woman because she has white features. Oh yeah, okay. You know, and so it's just this conditioning that becomes so embedded in our mental models that we can't even see it. And then from there it does this harm, often for me unintentionally harming people of color, because I don't even realize I'm holding these belief systems that are based on a hierarchy of human value. So
Thanks, Diane. Allie, Kelly, do you all want to add to that, build on that?
Go ahead, Allie.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, as someone who's done a lot of thinking in sociology, I think a lot about the ways that white supremacy is a structural part of a structural way that organizes the world in which we live. And so thinking about this, I draw a lot on the work of Beverly Daniel Tatum, who asks us to focus on racism and white supremacy as a system. And so thinking about a system of unearned privileges, unearned advantages, in a ways that creates what Diane is talking about, right? This hierarchy of value. And that Tatum reminds us that not all white folks benefit equally, right? So thinking about the ways that whiteness intersects and race intersects with other kinds of identities, and how that leads to unique experiences, and how we can think about that. And so the key part for me and for my understanding has always been this idea of white supremacy as a system. So it's a system comprised of individual beliefs, but it's also important to recognize the way it also kind of lives on its own outside of those individual beliefs. And so this change is also structural.
1000% agree. Hierarchy of human value, creating the structure, the delusion creates the structure. And then I would just build on it, the third level being white supremacy culture and the white supremacy cultural characteristics that Temo Kuhn's work has shown, you know, and she was put in the Harvard Business Review, I think it was 2011, but she's updated it since. There's a website about it. And when I read through these characteristics, I literally was like, oh, I thought I was supposed to do all of these things the best way possible. Like I was raised actually on this whole program of urgency and perfectionism and right to comfort and individualism and either or thinking and power hoarding, to the point where once I was looking at the words, I was like, oh, it's in the how I'm being that is racist, that is white supremacist. It's not just I'm a part of this, it's in the how that I am actually showing up that is also white supremacist, is also racist. So totally agree with Allie and Diane.
Thank you all for that. And so let's start talking about how white supremacy has showed up in your organization and your leadership as white women. How has it shown up for you? Allie, you want to kick us off?
Yes, absolutely. So I think Kelly, I think it was a great introduction of the white supremacy culture. If any of y'all have worked in a nonprofit, I am guessing that you have experienced white supremacy culture. It is all around us. It is the guiding culture of many nonprofits and is largely invisible. And I definitely want to echo Kelly's words that urgency is perhaps the one I see the most in nonprofits, or for me has been an experience that I see over and over again. Right? If you work in a nonprofit, racing to write the next grant, to deliver the program, to hire quickly, to answer the email, to get out the donor thank you notes, like it goes on and on and on, right? This urgency. And as many of us know, social service organizations and social service nonprofits are built on this idea of paternalism, right? So we as the staff, as the board, know what you as the people need. And so we're going to provide that, right? And so all of these are these really key features of this white supremacy culture that shows up time and time again. So those are just a couple examples. And I would say, you know, for me personally, the idea of conflict and conflict avoidance and not knowing how to engage in productive conflict has actually been a huge barrier, and that is in nonprofit life, and particularly as a white woman. This is, you know, the politics of nice that many of us as white women are trained in really is about avoiding conflict. I've heard white nonprofit leaders over and over again talk about, I'm just really bad at conflict. I really want to avoid conflict. And those are all things that help to kind of reproduce this system of white supremacy that really is just part of nonprofit culture. It's baked in.
Right. And we like to think of that as professionalism, right? Kelly and Diane, do you want to add to that?
I'll just, a lot of things what Ally said is certainly reflective of how white supremacy has played out in Women's Way. I think, you know, not actively seeking feedback, particularly from people of color, and making assumptions that like, well, they're not engaged or they're not participating because it's really on them. You know, their lack of motivation, their lack of commitment, and it becomes this very judgy blaming, right? Instead of seeking to understand and seeking feedback, because that I think is avoiding the conflict, Ally, of, well, maybe it's me or us that's creating a culture that is not embracing everyone's voice, that's not truly respecting. And even just the way we design our board meetings, it's like talk, do, no reflection, no real honest engagement. We're changing that conversation around that. And so I think, you know, the sense of urgency, the sense of doing, lack of self-reflection, lack of seeking feedback from those who work with you, your board members, or just other ways that white supremacy has really played out at Women's Way and other organizations I've been in. And I think that seeking that comfort, like, we're not gonna talk about it. We're choosing comfort and complacency, right? You know, over to like getting involved in these uncomfortable conversations and really being honest about this. So those are all kind of additional ways I think it has played out in our organization.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Diana. Kelly?
When we founded the opt-in, our intention has always been to center race equity. And that has been a journey of roller coaster ups and downs, and sort of trying to implementing the antidotes to the white supremacy culture whenever conscious to them. And Ally, yes, to your point, I definitely see my non-confrontation creep up. I see my perfectionism creep up. I see my right to comfort creep up. But overall, we're Black, Indigenous, women owned and led. And it's been a dance. And sometimes the dance feels great and sometimes it feels so awkward. And I feel like I'm walking for the first time. And it can be really painful, learning curve. And I wouldn't want to do it any other way. And white supremacy culture creeps up all the time in all of us. We have to be hypervigilant.
I'm wondering if you all would each, or one or two of you would be each to be willing to share a specific example of the way white supremacy showed up in your leadership, even in your attempt to sort of be anti-racist? How did a story of how it might have shown up specifically?
I have a really least proud story I can share. I don't hold shame about it anymore, but at the time, I was already on the journey, so I thought I was being conscious to my own behavior. We were on a second podcast interview in a day with an Asian woman, and I was tired and hungry, and it was Friday, and I had kids coming off the bus right to the house, and noisy downstairs, and I was I felt like we weren't getting to the point. I felt like time was running out. I felt like the conversation was going nowhere. And I started to be dismissive and sort of huffy and hoarding of my time and energy, and very uncomfortable. And I knew that I was not doing something right in the process. I knew that I wasn't handling it right. And in my download with Aurora, my partner at the time, afterwards, she said, you were really racist in that interview. And I was just like, oh, God, okay. I knew I wasn't doing something right. I was so tired. I was so hungry. And I said, I didn't know what to do. And I realized I didn't, and I think this happens a lot in white women. Like, I didn't have the practice saying what I needed at the time, and actually leaning to her to say, hey, I have to go attend to some stuff. Are you okay to finish on without me? And instead, I got like huffy and non-confrontational and like try to be okay and try to cover it up. And it was like, why couldn't I just communicate my needs at the time? Like, we all have needs, but then she felt devalued. She didn't feel like she was being honored as a person. I wasn't seeing her. I wasn't hearing her. And it was a major learning lesson for me. That was a big in the how I was being, that it was a learning lesson for me. And there was also a self-care lesson for me, is like, what I need to do, don't do 2 interviews in a day. You can't handle that yet. And building the endurance and stamina for staying in it. And making mistakes are some of the biggest gifts and treasures, with the hope that nobody is harmed in the process, obviously, but that it's, repairing that is key. And the learning is, there's blessings in that too.
Absolutely. Thank you for that story and that vulnerability, because I feel like we learn so much from each other when we can sort of share the personal about how we mess up and then how we recover and repair even when we're already on the journey. Yeah. I don't know if Diane or Allie wanted to add in the story.
When I first started at Women's Way, the board was predominantly white. It was an all-white staff, and I had a conversation, well, let's try to diversify our staff and our board. And we had opportunities because we had board members rotating off, and we had some new job positions. So we created a job description and sent it out through our typical outlets, Idealist, I don't know, Jess would know all of them, and a lot of the applicants were white. And so in my head, I was assuming, well, maybe there's just not enough people of color qualify for this position. Or maybe they're just not interested in working on gender equity issues. I started like putting the blame on them instead of saying, well, maybe it's the way we wrote the job descriptions and where we posted the job descriptions or the board descriptions that was still very biased towards white people. And so that was a lesson. I was thinking about all these biases that I was putting and blaming or making these assumptions about people of color, when it was actually our practices, how we were communicating it, where we were communicating it, that was limiting the pool of applicants. So now we're really restructuring that whole thing, right? And that was falling on me as a leader, that I made that mistake. So yeah, it was just an example.
Yeah, another great example. And I think one that comes up frequently. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about how white supremacy is related to gender equity and the gender wealth gap. Oh, you're on mute, Diane. It's okay.
Will you repeat that again? I'm sorry, I was reading
Yeah.
a note in the chat.
It's okay. How is white supremacy related to gender equity and the gender wealth gap? If you can drill down a little bit more, Kelly introduced us in the beginning, but so if we could just drill down on that a bit more.
I'd be glad to talk about it unless someone else wants to. Okay. Well, at Women's Way, I think we look at equity as kind of the fair treatment, access, and opportunity and advancement of all people. And if you look at gender equity of all women, right? While at the same time striving to dismantle and eliminate barriers that have prevented full participation of all women. And if you really look at, we could just say all women, right? And we assume that, all women are the same and experiencing the same levels of oppression, same types of barriers. But as we know, that white supremacy has this hierarchy of human value, and those at the bottom of the economic pyramid are women of color. And then if you add sexual orientation and ability, it's even at the very bottom because of this hierarchy that's gendered and racialized. And so an economic system that looks at women of color, trans women of color as less valuable, right, at that intersection, then the system intentionally puts on more barriers and makes it even more difficult to have access to equal opportunities, access to asset building opportunities. And so I think we have to understand that gender and racial equity are one and the same. They are both byproducts of white supremacy and a hierarchy of human value. And if you don't address racial equity, you will never achieve gender equity. And also something I just read, white supremacy needs anti-Blackness to thrive. Right? Because that's the scenario, right? It's a zero-sum game, right? If we give more to Black women, then white women will have less, right? And I think this whole thing of anti-Blackness, that we need to keep driving it and having it thrive, which is what keeps white supremacy alive, is a driver of gender inequities and racial inequities. So we have to address both. And frankly, if we really work to design policy and practices that directly impact those at the bottom of the economic pyramid, we all will benefit and we'll all be elevated. So for us, racial equity, being anti-racist, is central to achieving gender equity.
Absolutely. Okay. So let's come back more to the personal journey. And I think we talked earlier about how difficult it can be for white folks, especially to recognize the way that they have internalized white supremacy, to own the ways in which they've benefited from white supremacy and racism. And so I'm curious about sort of what has helped you all in your own personal journeys of cultivating a positive anti-racist identity, white identity, and like what helped you be able to face the internalized white superiority that lives in each of you. And Kelly, you want to get us started?
I love this question. Thanks, Deirdre. I think when I look back at my own journey, I started out very, as you guessed, individualistically in doing this work. And I think if I knew that racial identity development was a thing and it was a non-linear sort of roller coaster-ish growth path, that may have been a little bit more reassuring for me at the time. So I'm here to spread the news that there is the journey is non-linear and keep going. And I kind of go down to like the smallest common denominator of like habits. Like we're all just these humans, these beings with a bunch of habits. And it's like, what are my habits contributing to each day? Because I'm only one person, and yet I am part of systems, part of units, part of other relationships and communities. And so for me, the process of my own racial development has been moving from just myself into different areas where there's more people. So different communities, be it some of my communities are multiracial, where there's rich learning, and some of my communities are white affinity-based learning, which is really rich learning that sometimes we need to do on our own. So that we're not burdening or triggering Black, Indigenous, or non-Black people of color with our learnings or our faulty, practices. It's been a lot of self-awareness building, and even like therapy and recovery. I got sober a year and a half ago. Just getting the obstacles to understanding myself out of the way that were inhibiting me from really seeing myself and sort of numbing me out to things. To becoming more racially literate, especially about my own whiteness, and really like building stamina and staying in it. So making mistakes, getting back up, needing time off, getting back in. Just the constant reinfusing of my motivation and strengthening of my habits, and building up of my faith too. I mean, this isn't, we're not going to think our ways out of this. I feel that this is really heart-centered work, and I had to get to my heart. I felt like the Grinch, like my heart was like 2 sizes too small thanks to white supremacy. And I had to sort of break that open and keep breaking it open, to be honest.
Thank you, Kelly. Ally or Diane?
Sure, I'll jump in here. I want to just amplify what Kelly said around, it's this ongoing, constant learning process. And my partner's in education, and she talks a lot about this idea of a learner stance, which is really like very much the antithesis to the idea of perfectionism in white supremacy culture. And so how can we position ourselves as constantly learning and constantly making mistakes and constantly revising? So I think that's really critical. I will say, for my own personal journey, having white folks model what anti-racist whiteness looks like has been really, really important. I didn't see a lot of that growing up. I didn't know what that looked like. And so having folks be really direct with me, having white folks really model that for me, has been critical at critical stages in my own life and in my own development and thinking around this. And then, as I said before, I think for me, really having a structural perspective and being able to, like, for me, a structural perspective around white supremacy was my way through guilt, which I think, as I think someone mentioned earlier, really a lot of white folks get stuck in the guilt space of it, which is not super helpful in terms of moving forward in anti-racist ways, or thinking about anti-racism and other liberation kinds of movements. And so really allowing me to understand that this was a system that I didn't create. This is a system from which I benefit, and what is my responsibility as a white person towards challenging and dismantling that system was really critical knowledge for me to like kind of find a way through and to keep moving.
Thank you, Ally. Diane?
Yeah, it's a great question, Deidre. Because for years, I thought I was doing racial justice work. I started 2 nonprofits, one in the heart of an all Black community, but I came in with the perspective of I'm the white savior. And I never really focused on my whiteness. I focused on their Blackness and their disadvantages. So how can I help them, right? Without even asking, like, how arrogant, right? And how harmful. And I've done some harm. So I'd done some harm, not intentionally. I thought I was doing really good stuff. And it wasn't until I started shifting to looking at whiteness and what does that mean, and how I have unearned advantages and privileges, that I shifted my whole way of looking at racism and how to be an anti-racist. And also I thought, maybe if I just do good and help these, poor Black people, I'm not being racist, and really understanding like how to be an anti-racist, right? And so I also, and it means action. So it means like being not being a bystander, but an upstander. So when I see an act of microaggression, racism, I need to speak up. And sometimes I define racism as not being mean, but I was silent. So I think, digging deep, both into what whiteness is, what white supremacy is, and also digging deep into the history of this country, because I did not learn any of this. And that's part of white supremacy, our education system, right? And when I started really digging deep into the history, and I'm embarrassed that it took me this long, I was like, holy shit. And then the challenge was, I'm white and I'm associated with white. And how do I separate myself from whiteness? But I can't, so there's all this stuff like, no, just own it, Diane, own it, and understand how it's playing out and what you can do to challenge it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you all have said it, but I just want to punctuate that this is not a linear. Developing a positive anti-racist identity is not linear. It needs to happen the work has to be done cross-racially, has to be done in white affinity with accountability to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, right? So I appreciate what you all are offering there. So let's go on and talk about, so now you're starting to work this muscle and you recognize you have some power and privilege. So like, what do you do with it? Like, how do you use the power that you have as white people, as white leaders of organizations, to champion racial equity inside of your organization and in your lives? Kelly, you want to kick us off with that one?
Sure. For me, it's this, the more that I can speak to my story as specifically and vulnerably as possible, I hope to be of service in any way where it helps other white folks, other white women, be able to look at themselves, be able to love themselves, be able to challenge themselves and take accountability for their own racial identity, their own self-awareness, their own cross-racial connection, lack thereof of cross-racial connection, and stamina to stay in it. So I am not an expert in this, never will be. I am a student, I'm a learner, I am on the path, and I don't want to do this alone. I cannot do this alone. So I welcome as many people as possible to join us, because it is, I've never, when I was always a seeker and I was always a learner and always wanted like self-betterment. Not until I understood my own racial identity was I realizing I was missing out on 95% of who I was in this world. And so understanding my racial identity everything makes sense. Like once you understand race and the past is never past, then things start to make a lot of sense. And realizing, to Allie's point, that it's all by design, that speaking to that and shining a light on all of these aspects, so that other people say, oh, you know what? Yeah, I experienced that too. I know nothing I say is going to be that foreign from somebody else. So however I can show up, and I have to pray about and meditate about that every day to make sure that I'm coming from a really heart and human-centered place when I'm doing that, because whiteness is very egoic, and the ego can sneak in the back door, and he's doing push-ups in the parking lot. So, none of my lines, but I don't always have the quotes and who they are readily available. But I think it was Dan Harris that said the push-ups in the parking lot, or at least it was in his book.
I was muted. Thank you, Kelly. Diane or Allie, do you want to add on about how your use of power and privilege?
Yeah, I'll add on. Love what Kelly said. I think as a white woman leader who had that's a position of power and influence. One of the ways is first of all doing this, having these type of conversations, and having us as white women speaking about this from our own personal experiences. But it's also working to change the culture of our organization. And so this is the inner work. And I'm going to be very transparent. Deidre Ashton was one of the consultants who worked with our organization for the past year. That I've been doing this work internally, examining my own internalized white supremacy and how do I do that inner work. And I think we skip that step a lot as white folks. We immediately go to policies and practices, right? And so it's really critical that I do this inner work on an individual level, as a citizen, as a friend, but as a leader, I need to do this on an ongoing basis. So what I'm practicing is and making space for self-examination and self-reflection every day. I'm making space for seeking feedback, particularly from staff who are people of color and board members, and providing a safe space, because that's a power dynamic, right? And saying, listen, I'm seeking advice and I want honest advice because there's some things I've done that have harmed others and I don't know unless I seek feedback. So that's what I'm doing as a leader, and I'm listening a lot more. And I'm also mobilizing resources as much as I can, because it's also about resources and opportunities for people of color, women of color entrepreneurs, people of color led nonprofits. We are really trying to distribute more resources, financial and other sources supports for people of color led organizations and women of color entrepreneurs. These are just some other examples. But I think remaining humble and open and honest, doing that self-reflection, seeking feedback are really important practices as a leader, and listening with the intent to really understand, not to judge, right? To really understand, and having a curious mindset, and constantly learning, like Kelly says. I'm digging deep. I read more stuff. In fact, I just read The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, fabulous book. Yeah. So I'm constantly, and having that learner mindset. Like I'm not an expert, I'm a learner. And as a leader, we need to have learning mindsets. So those are just some examples.
Thank you, Diane. And you all didn't say this explicitly, but I heard it writing underneath, is that you have to have some skin in the game. You have to be willing to risk what you have. You have to be willing to have boards upset with you and funders upset with you if you're really going to embrace an anti-racist culture and approach in your organizations. So let's go to our last question, and then we want to have a little time for Q&A. And so if you each think about your organizations, what are you doing to challenge and dismantle white supremacy? What policies and practices have you changed and are you implementing to become an anti-racist organization? Allie, you want to start us there?
Yes, thank you. This is where I spend a lot of my time thinking. I am in charge of ops at my organization, and so which includes finance and operations and facilities and HR. And so I am hugely influenced by Kim Monique Johnson. If y'all have not seen the work that she's doing, it's phenomenal around HR practices. And so really, really thinking about HR in critical ways. So a couple things that we've been doing. First is we spend a lot of time at figuring out as an organization how are we approaching these issues? How are we approaching systemic inequality? Are we doing DEI work? Are we doing anti-racist work? And where we landed is on a model of collective liberation. And so we're really thinking about this work as under a collective liberation model. And so this is the idea for us that liberation or freedom for queer people is inextricably tied to liberation for all. And so this is an idea that comes from Black and Brown and Indigenous activists. MLK said, no one is free until we're all free. Audre Lorde said, I'm not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are different from mine. And so this idea that it was important for us to all recognize that we have a horse in this race. And so being able to name that within our org, and that this shifted the orientation from good white people help others who are oppressed to everyone is worthy and valuable because of their humanity, and that systems of oppression harm all of us, right? And so really being in this collective liberation mindset has been the orientation that we've taken up this work. In terms of policy and culture, I think for us, it's been really evaluating policy from an intersectional lens. So rather than thinking about what are the pros and cons of this policy, which often are about organizational pros and cons, really centering who and how will different folks experience these policies? Will there be folks disproportionately affected by particular policies? So a small but great example is putting salaries on job descriptions or salary ranges when you're putting out a call for a job, right? There's a lot of HR debate about whether or not you should do this. Spoiler, y'all should do it if you're not already, and many folks are. And we know that this is an important practice, right? Like job searches take time, they take resources, they take money, they require childcare, they require you taking time off of work. And so thinking about who is able and to spend the resources, to spend the time, to spend the money doing a job search. We know we've talked about, Kelly showed us earlier how wealth is unevenly distributed. And so really thinking about how these policies, by not putting a salary on a job description, might disproportionately affect folks who might have the ability to apply willy-nilly to many jobs, not knowing if the salary is going to support them, support their life. These kinds of things can be really, really important. Thinking about, do we really need to require a high school diploma? Do we really need a college degree for this job? What are the ways that we think about those kinds of credentials as gatekeeping tools? How do we think about that in relation to lived experiences and other kinds of ways of knowing? How do we value those kinds of things, right? So really thinking about a lot of those things. And then lastly, really thinking about how we might envision radical policies that disproportionately support equity work. And so thinking around, we know that student loan debt is a much higher burden for Black folks. And so thinking about, I've been doing research on student loan forgiveness and student loan repayment policies as a benefit practice that nonprofits and other organizations can offer. And really thinking about how a policy like this might disproportionately affect in really strong ways Black and Brown and Indigenous staff, and really thinking about those kinds of things and kind of radical HR options to think about. Kim Monique Johnson. So that's some of the stuff that we've been thinking about.
Thanks, Allie. That was helpful. That was really helpful and concrete. Diane or Kelly, are there additional thoughts you have in response to this question?
Yeah, that was super helpful, Allie. Thank you. There's just a couple data points that I didn't need to know much about financially why I should be putting my money in Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But there's the whole system of white supremacy started with money and it's going to end with money. And so I am constantly sort of saying that to myself. And there's this stat that it keeps coming to mind where it's 98% of tradable assets. So tradable assets is stocks, bonds, property, you name it. 98% are managed by white men. So in any way, shape, or form, however I spend a dollar, in every way, in my family, in my home, and in my business especially, it has to be going to Black, Indigenous, non-Black people of color, to center race equity. And I think people go, well, what about my company? I'm like, the numbers are just too vast. Like, we have got to. So in our company, like I said, it's Black and Indigenous, woman owned and led. Everyone from our attorney to our lawyer to our graphic designer to our Black, Indigenous, non-Black, LGBTQA, as intersectional as possible. That's who we're meeting with first. And they're, to be honest, they're the people that are understanding what we're doing the best as well. So we have white people, also a lot of white people working with us that are on sort of sliding scales depending on need. Some of us work for zero money because we gain things that are extremely valuable to us, whereas money is not exactly what we're seeking necessarily. And so that's, that's just a couple examples of how things with us have been going. But yeah, there's this model that the Race Equity Institute uses, where it's sort of equates money to blood. And so if like the blood in the body goes to the place that needs it most. So that's how I kind of like to, if I have that visual in my head of money, that helps me because I have a very dysfunctional vision of money. So when I think of money, I try to think of blood and it rushing to the place that needs it the most.
Thanks, Kelly. Diane?
So interesting. About 3 years ago, Women's Way started, we made a decision that racial equity has to be really part of our mission, our theory of change as an organization that's addressing gender equity. So we started this whole initiative where we started evaluating every organizational aspect area of Women's Way. So staff hiring, board culture, board development, vendors, our grant making programs, our hiring practices. And we started looking at how are we doing this through the lens of white supremacy. And we have a staff lead and a board lead. So we require 100% board engagement and we work together in this. But during this process, it wasn't easy to get everyone on board, but we're on board. We realized, and this is, thank you, Deidre and Sarah Haley, that if we don't address, and I'm going to go back to this because we skip this a lot, the inner work, which is addressing our learned racism and how white superiority and Black inferiority play out in our mental models, we're going to continue to make the same mistakes. We might think we're doing all great stuff, but until we do that inner work, sorry, that's my phone. We need to do that before we do the outer work, which is creating the policies and practices and all that. We started with the outer work before examining our own internalized racism, right? That we all learn. Sorry about my phone, it's over there. And so we spent a year, right, Deidre, on this journey of really exploring our internalized racism. And we had the most amazing conversations with our board members. And I learned more about my board members in probably 6 months than I had in 3 years because of these conversations that we had, and because Deidre and her partner created a safe place for us to have these conversations. And now we're embarking on the outer work. And so we are looking at every organizational area and what's our baseline? How do we start dismantling white supremacy on every aspect? And one of the things we're going to do is, and we're creating a whole equity action plan with metrics like goals, strategies, and measuring it. Because if we don't measure it, how do we know we're changing it? And we're going to put it on our website because transparency is a critical part of equity. And we're going to be transparent about what our goals are, what's our progress, mistakes, learnings. So stay tuned. That's something we're working on right now. And it's been the most empowering experience and has brought us closer together, the board, the staff. So it's been an amazing experience in that respect.
Thank you, Diane. And my prediction is, as you talk about doing the inner work first, absolutely, then the outer work, and then what's going to happen is that's going to feed back in onto the inner work, that it's going to be this circular process, and you will get deeper and deeper in not only your commitment to anti-racism, but how it is seen through in the organization, how it is enacted organizationally. So I want to thank you all for walking with us through these questions. I want to take a few minutes, we probably have about 10 minutes to take some Q&A from the audience. We do have one question in the chat, and I will invite others, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A box. And so the question that's in the chat is actually for Kelly. In that example that Kelly just gave, although I get it, are we saying that this is about the guest on your show, the Asian guest on your show? Are we saying that Kelly did not show respect because the woman was a woman of color? How would Kelly have seen herself if the woman was white?
What's coming up for me is that in my journey of dismantling white supremacy in myself, I've learned about sort of the power over and power under that happens in racism and sexism, that there's a power dynamic. And so in my part of the journey where I was at that time, the pendulum had swung. I was sort of, when I was clueless about my own racial identity, I was very power over. I just did whatever the hell I wanted to do and acted the way I wanted to do wherever I did it. As I became more aware of it, I started to be very power under and would give my power away to anybody of color or social disadvantage lesser than mine. Neither is healthy. So I had to get to a place where I could be with whomever it was at the table to see them and say, this is what I need at this time, and I hope that this is okay. Instead of not voicing what I needed or saying, I've got to get out of here. So I can't answer if they're white or not, how it would be different. All I can say is that in my journey, the pendulum swung from being used to having power over to people to thinking that I had to give all my power away. And neither of those things are true. That's actually just narcissism playing out as a manipulation to try to create connection with another person. So sort of getting rid of some of those dysfunctional ways of being, and being more aware of them and starting to own become more accountable. I hope whoever the person is, I can see them as a human in those situations. And I can't exactly say if the person was white, I wouldn't be like, hey, I got to go, because I'm just used to acting the way I was acting with a white person. Perhaps that's the way I would go. I don't know, but I hope that helps.
Thank you, Kelly. So we have another question in the chat, and I'm going to read it. Here it is. It's a little lengthy, so bear with me. My experience of running a small grassroots nonprofit organization that serves a refugee community lower in human values, I'm not sure I understand, was very challenging to secure, sustain adequate resources to support all the various programs and services, and to pay a comparable wage for my staff. I believe there's a huge pay gap between grassroots community-based nonprofit staff and larger, well-established organizations. But yet larger organizations are not prepared to reach various vulnerable communities, and oftentimes depend on the local community-based organizations to reach these vulnerable communities with limited to no fair compensation. I've been wondering if there have been discussion among funders about this disparity. Diane, you want to take this?
Yeah, there's a lot in what she just wrote. Part of philanthropy grew out of white supremacy. Let's just be honest about that. This is where I take a risk, because there's probably funders watching this, but that's a risk I'm going to take. And it's shifting, but philanthropy was not designed to promote equity, right? It was really mainly a tax shelter for people who accumulate massive amounts of wealth, right? And to kind of divert the attention away from asking questions, how did you get that wealth to begin with, to, oh, you're a philanthropist, isn't that wonderful? Tied to that is less than 1% of philanthropic dollars go to women of color led organizations, and less to grassroots and smaller organizations, because it's this whole idea, we don't trust you. You're small. And there's a lot of mistrust historically for Black and brown led nonprofit organizations. And that's grounded in that whole hierarchy of human value, which goes into a hierarchy of trusting people. And that you have to prove yourself worthy, right? And this whole notion that, you know, wealth begets wealth. So if you don't have a lot of money, we are not going to trust you to give you more money. And so there are a lot of discussions right now with the philanthropic sector, because it needs to be disrupted and transformed. And part of the conversation is now they have trust-based philanthropy, community-centric. Think about that, trust-based philanthropy. So philanthropists didn't really trust a lot of nonprofit directors, particularly those who were led by people of color. And so these discussions are happening, which is a good thing. But again, that's part of a white supremacism that's holding on to their power. And there's a great line in terms of, so let me go back. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place. So what we're doing, we're investing money into women of color led organizations with very small budgets and more grassroots organizations, because they don't get enough funding. And yet, like you said, they're deeply connected to communities. They're making great impact. So that's one thing, is how we're addressing it. But these discussions, we're having these discussions with funders, and we need to have more discussions about what do we mean by equity and grant making, and how do we foster that. And one last thing, I think, you know, if we really want equity and grant making, philanthropists have to give up decision-making power, not just money. And who's making the decisions of where money goes and who gets to receive it. That should come from community and those impacted by injustices. That's a huge disruption in philanthropy, but good discussions to have.
So Diane, you were starting to speak to where we need to go next in our closing few minutes, which is around action steps, right? So like we want to send folks home with some ideas about what they can actually do in their organizations and in their lives to dismantle white supremacy. So I'm going to name the 3 questions, and then each of you can respond to whichever question you prefer. What steps can funders take to address white supremacy? What can not-for-profit leaders do? What can policymakers do? So if we could hear from each of you, your closing advice to folks today that they can act on immediately.
I'm happy to get us started if that's okay. Yeah, these are great questions. So I think a couple of things. One, I just want to riff a little bit on what Diane was saying around funding and what can funders do? And I think that all of the things that Diane identified, and I also think that we really need to, all of us, be thinking critically about the 501c3 designation, think about fiscal sponsorships. How can larger organizations fiscally sponsor other organizations that aren't able to access 501c3 status? Thinking through some of those ways kind of beyond and outside of traditional grant making, I think is really important. In terms of nonprofit leaders, I want to just be really transparent that I am speaking to white nonprofit leaders. We can make space, right? We can make bigger tables. We can move out of the way. We can cultivate leaders of color within our orgs. These things are really important. We can lift up leaders who are already doing this work. They might be Black and brown nonprofit leaders. They might be Black and brown and Indigenous community leaders. And also what Kelly said is spend our money where with vendors of color, spend our money with Black-led vendors, consultants. Really, let's put our money where our mouth is if we're really talking about doing anti-racist work. Thank you so much for the invite to be here today.
Thank you for your wonderful insights, Ally. So let's hear from Kelly.
I'm happy to go. I'm going to answer the question, what steps can white folks take to address white supremacy in all of those areas? But I would say first in self-awareness, a great tool I've done multiple times is Layla Saad's Me and White Supremacy 30-day journaling prompts. It really excavates a lot in me that I did not know was there or kind of didn't want to see was there, but really needed to write it down to excavate it. Build racial literacy. When it comes to white racial literacy, the Seeing White podcast is phenomenal. I'm actually in White Learning Spaces called Aware that we go through it for 14 weeks. It is an unbelievable podcast. It's done by Scene on Radio, SCENE, Scene on Radio. And we're going to give out resources at the end, I believe. I think Kelly said that, but so these will be on there. Connection, I would follow 30 Black, Indigenous, non-Black people of color that you aren't already following and just observe and like. There's no need to comment, but change your algorithm so you can hear and see different perspectives, hear and see yourself a little bit differently. And then finally, stamina is like finding community, finding people, an accountability buddy, finding a learning space, finding people to talk with and listen to, because it's just the real joy of this work is found in community.
Thank you, Kelly and Diane.
Yeah, all good stuff, and I agree with everything. I'll just be brief. I think everyone needs to do the inner work first, and I think again we skip that critical step. So I think foundations need to do that work. I think policymakers have to do that work. I think all leaders have to, particularly white leaders, have to do that work. And you can, and there's money out there to hire consultants to do that. And I think it's really critical. I think having those impacted by injustices should be at the table. Policy tables, funding tables, tables in nonprofits, boards, and their voices need to be heard. They need to be co-creating strategies, helping determine how to use resources. And so I think those are just things that all these sectors can do to really promote more equity in the work that they do, and really having a shared leadership model. And also when we invite women with lived experience to come, they are looked at as subject matter experts. We pay them for their intellectual property. So we need to stop extracting them and using them to promote our own fundraising, which is something I learned. I did it before. So I think these are just some of the things that I think will help promote dismantle white supremacy in all those sectors.
Well, thank you all for your wisdom, your experience, your vulnerability, your willing to share the mistakes and the recoveries, and your ownership of being in an ongoing journey and knowing when to lead and when to follow. So I'm going to turn this over to Kelly to close us out.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear and see me. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. We just want to thank everyone again. Thank each and every one of you for your attendance, participation, and engagement in the conversation. Reminder that this series is ongoing, so we'll continue to explore closing the gender wealth gap in our series. And you'll see the dates and topics listed here. We also want to continue the conversation about white supremacy and engage more with you, our partners and community. So check out our social media and our website for announcements on the next community conversation, where we'll talk together about white supremacy, and follow us for more information and invitation to join us in the fight. So I think with that, we'll bid you all adieu. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.